extra special, extra wonderful Last of Us Part 2 episode of Normandy FM. We're into it now. We're into the deep. We're into some real deep stuff this week. It gets real. I am Eric Van Allen, one of your co-hosts, alongside Kenneth Shepard. Ken, how you doing today?
I'm good. Was the death of Joel not real enough for you, Eric? Or we just get into the real stuff?
I mean, now we're in, like, the game. We're, like, into the game parts. Like, we're through the prologue. We have set up the conflict, and we are taking off to Seattle to start the grand adventure. And joining us on this grand adventure is one Janet Garcia. How are you doing today, Janet?
Pretty good. How are you?
I'm doing okay. You know, I'm a little tired. I was up late last night playing this video game. But I think I'm doing all right now.
Nice.
Are you excited to talk about some Last of Us?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially looking back at all of this, I think this might be my, probably my, I don't know if it's my favorite section of the game, but it's really up there. It sort of hits a lot of points that I think for a lot of people who played through this is sort of, in a way, the highlight, because it does so many different things well.
Janet, since you are new to the show, how about you give the folks at home a little bit of introduction about who you are, what you do, and also kind of how you got into The Last of Us, how you got acquainted with the series in the first place.
Sure. So for those who don't know me, my name is Janet Garcia. My handle is Game Honestus on the internet. I am a game critic and content creator. I am also a Min-Max cohort, so you'll see me on that podcast approximately once a week. You know, it's a weekly show, so I'm on most of those episodes at this point. Sometimes I'm on Kind of Funny as well. I do a lot of like streaming. I have my own podcast. I do reviews, previews, all of that good stuff. And I have a background in guides from my time at IGN. And then before that, I was just freelancing, doing a bunch of other stuff. As far as Last of Us history, it's pretty recent. I honestly did not beat the first game until the year that Last of Us 2 came out. I beat it like maybe a month before The Last of Us 2. So while everyone else in the world had to wait so many years for the epic follow-up of the epic story, I was like, oh, it's around the corner. And for me, I basically just, missed it when it came out, and then it had a bunch of, ports or remasters or refinements or whatever, but I kept just like starting it and not getting far enough in and then having to restart. So I played the beginning of Last of Us 1 over under, I'm going to say maybe 4 times. I also had some file cloud save issues, so I kept replaying it. And it didn't really click for me a lot of the times I had played through it at first, but when I finally committed to it, I started to see, what really makes it special. And, without, I guess, I don't know who'd be listening to this that also didn't play the first one and cares about spoilers for the first one. But in case that person exists, just like iconic combat moments, the winter season, even the ending, which I didn't know the ending going in because like I had existed in the world, right. But I didn't know the details of the lines from that scene at the very end. And those details were the ending to me. So I still felt like really satisfied with it because I only knew like the spark notes of The Last of Us, and I really got a lot out of playing that. And then for the second one, I wrote the walkthrough for it alongside Brendan Graber. Shout out to Brendan for finding those coins, because I was real scared that I was going to have to find all the coins myself, and I was very tired. So overall, I probably spent, with at least the game on, I checked my runtime today, I have 47 hours in The Last of Us 2. Haven't platinumed yet. Probably will go back and do that at some point using my /art guide from the time. But yeah, absolutely loved it. Had a great time playing it.
Yeah, I actually pulled up your guides to get through some of this open world section to make sure that I was hitting all the right spots. So thank you for that.
You're welcome. And yeah, shout out to Brendan, who did a lot of that collectible stuff.
That is like the weird part of this, and I guess like a good way for us to segue into what this section is, which is it's Ellie's day one in Seattle. And, we've had our entire prologue where we had a very emotional opening to the game, all the way up through Joel's death and setting out after Tommy runs off. So we're rolling up to Seattle, Ellie and Dina on a horse, and we get through a few kind of very basic, I'd say, The Last of Us sections, but then once we get past that, it just opens up. Yep. And I think there's some interesting stuff here in the beginning where they're talking between each other. You have kind of some, I don't want to call them like flashbacks, but just like references to various things that Ellie has done in the past as kind of a way of, it was like kind of a sneaky way, I think, for them to be like, hey, remember all this stuff you did in The Last of Us Part 1? And it's Dina just kind of going like, hey, remember how you murdered a bunch of people in one place and made them mad, or how you murdered some other people in another place and made them mad? Or like maybe they're the ones that killed Joel. But I do think it still feels kind of weird in the context of that. Like, I feel the game does not really hide the fact that it's related to the Fireflies in some way, you know, by just the way it framed it in the beginning. Like we were talking about, having those flashbacks to the surgeon and everything in the first place. They're kind of like throwing up the signpost that it's the Fireflies. But once we get through some initial stuff of getting around some gates and things like that, we get into a very large open world section. And that's kind of like most of the intro of this area is doing some, and Ken, you might be able to speak better to this, but it's like some Uncharted 4 open world stuff going on here. So I'm wondering if you could like comment on that one a little bit, because I obviously have not played any Uncharted game ever, and I refuse to because Ken won't let me let go of it.
It was weird because like Uncharted 4 had open areas, but it was like very specific points in the game. It like, okay, here's an open area. As soon as you like kind of get through here and go with what you're doing, it gets back to kind of more, like the more closed off linear stuff of what more people kind of associate with that series. Where even Uncharted Lost Legacy, which was kind of like mostly open world for like a large section of that, and then it did, you know, kind of funnel in but it felt very much like that was something that like Uncharted 4 like takes Last of Us's kind of stealth mechanics, but Last of Us took Uncharted's more open sections, and like you can see the way they're playing off each other. Altogether, I don't know that like I care for these sections that much, because like I am not like an open world person, and I don't think even I wouldn't say they misunderstand what is interesting about, like, quote unquote interesting about open world sections. Because like, I think there are like interesting things to find, interesting like instances of, you know, combat and also like storytelling that are interesting. But I'm always a person that's like, if you can have all these sections closer together and not like make the act of getting into them a chore, I'm all for that. But I do think also that these are small enough that it does not feel as overwhelming as something like a more dedicated open world game does.
Janet, how did you kind of feel about like this shift in The Last of Us from being a more like linear, straightforward, like, you know, level by level thing to having these sort of sections where you branch out and you have this big map where you're marking things and putting down question marks and checking them out and crossing them off?
I loved it, even though the map, oh gosh, it's such like a kid's menu of a map.
Right.
And it's just like, I don't know, it's one of those things where I love it for the lore, but I hate it for the functionality because like, did you try using that map? It's horrible. Yeah. Like, it just feels like, I don't know, so basic, and you know, it's in game, like, you know, you unravel it and it does feel very lived in, but the practicality of it kind of gets lost in the weeds there. But overall, I liked that it's more open. I think it lends itself well to what they're trying to do narratively too, because it makes it so that these dialogue moments that we have while they're kind of going from point A to point B or exploring within an area feel a lot more natural, and it's harder for them, or in some cases impossible for them, to be interrupted by the next action. So it makes it really seamless, even though it's obviously by design that like we have just enough time walking through this forest to talk about like the first time we killed somebody and all of that. But I like how that melds together so well. And I also just like having a little bit more to look at. One of my favorite things about The Last of Us, like as a franchise, because I guess it's a franchise now, is how simmy it is. And I know it's something you guys touched on last episode. But yeah, I mean, you know, the combat is great. I enjoy it fine. But what I really want to do is look around at old stuff and open drawers and look for scrap and look for medicine and do all of that. And I enjoy that the openness gives you more spots to dig into, explore, and potentially find stuff. So you're often rewarded for doing the exploration, either through items that can be used to make you stronger or to upgrade yourself, or narratively. Right.
Because I think that like there are a lot of interesting like side narratives that happen. You're like the bank. If you go there, you kind of like through looking at notes and the infected that are there, you realize, oh, like a group of people thought it would be like a great idea to try and rob a bank on outbreak day, and this is kind of like what happened to them. It didn't work out, and then they were left here and infected, and they had like bulletproof vests, so like you couldn't fight them as easily as you could like a normal infected, and it's just stuff like that. Like I do think I'll give them the credit that like they did make the most of the space they had and were able to really like lean into like the environmental storytelling that I think The Last of Us kind of excels at.
I think all of the stuff that y'all have talked about is what makes that stuff really good. Like the environmental storytelling is really good. I do like the idea that there are some optional, stuff. We were talking before the podcast started about how there are like some upgrades you can pick up here, but you can also end up picking up if you just roll along the critical path, like the shotgun. There are some that I think you can only get here, like getting the additional holster for Ellie, which is like, anyone who's played Last of Us Part 1 knows how good having another holster is. So that was great. And also much later on, and we'll talk a little bit more about it then, but like getting some of the extra training manuals and stuff like that is really, really helpful. But I'm going to say something that Ken is not going to like right now.
Great. Love that for me.
The thing about the map that got me was that it felt too video gamey to me. And I think for a series that has so far been really good about like pulling you in and making you like engage with the world, and like a good example is you have these gates that you're working through, and each of the gates you have to go through these generator puzzles to get them plugged in, but you also have to punch in a code. And I did find it was really funny to me that first big gate that you open up so that Dina and Shimmer can get through. You have to like throw the cable over the top and plug it in and all that. There was a numpad there, but all the numbers were gone. So I was looking at it and I was like, I wonder if kids today would have trouble figuring out this puzzle, because how often does like the modern youngster interact with a numpad? Like it's such a
pin numbers for debit cards.
I guess there are pin numbers, but I the first thing I think when I see a numpad and like that sort of like typing things out is the T9 typing that we used to have to use on phones.
Yeah.
Maybe this is the sign that I'm getting really old, is that I'm like, back in my day we had T9 typing, but I was looking at that and I was like, oh yeah, you're gonna have to know like what these numbers are if you're going to figure this puzzle out, because the other ones do show the numbers on them, but you had to like look at a piece of paper, and of course I ended up cheating and like taking a picture of it on my phone so I could just pull that up instead of pulling that out. But I was like, that's kind of cool, that's like a physical thing that you're having to pull out and read potentially, whereas with the map it like put up these big blinking blue question marks, and it always had you like located, like a big "you are here" thing on there. And I almost wish that you would have had to like, there are times when you get a letter and it's like, oh, it's in the shop on like 6th and whatever street. And you would have to actually pay attention to the signs or pull the map out and like look, or even just like, into it the way that a city is built, where you have rising numbers in one direction and rising letters in the other direction. And you have to kind of figure out like, okay, I have to go here and this is where I need to end up. I would have liked that a little bit more, just because it would have made it feel less like what it ultimately felt like to me, which was like, Ken, we love to call it open world bullshit. Like I'm going to go check things off of a list, and I'm going to make all the question marks no longer be question marks. And so even though I really like some segments like the synagogue, where you get to talk to Dina a little bit about faith and her heritage, her family and all that, and the courthouse I thought was really interesting too. You ultimately just end up like kind of running around and getting question marks and filling off question marks, and I was like, I don't know, that felt a little video gamey for what The Last of Us usually ends up being.
Do I remember correctly? Did Firewatch have a mode where like you could like you pull out its map and not have like your icon on there, and you just kind of had to intuit where things were? Or was that maybe like a concept they brought up at some point? Maybe doing.
Sounds like a Firewatch thing to do.
Yeah, because that sounds familiar to me.
Yeah, I think the area is just a little too big to like be able to do that. Like, I think it is a cool idea if you had to sort of read more of the world, and they, you know, without getting too far ahead, there are instances where, you know, this game does that, but I think it's just like a little bit too big. But I do get how it's like a kind of a half measure where it's like, it's real enough that we're opening the map, but fake enough that I have a blinking dot.
Right.
The blinking dots were what really got me, where I was like, I could maybe understand it if she was just writing like question marks on there and then crossing them off. Like, that was good. But they were literally like blinking blue lights. And I was like, no, this is taking me right out of it. Like, please stop. So I don't know. That's not the only very video gamey thing that I didn't like in this section, but we'll get to that one in a moment. But storyline wise, I do feel like this is very Last of Us in terms of like it's very slow at the beginning. You know, you're kind of you're coming into the city. You're looking for the WLF, as you will soon start to call the wolves, as you make the brilliant connection after seeing a wolf painting next to the WLF. And there's a lot of environmental storytelling. I love that they keep calling it the Fuck Fedra Gate. That's a really good running gag. And you're just kind of picking up different pieces of story as you're moving through here. They seem to really just lean into the sort of, ambient, like, we're going to kind of give you some idea of where the story might be headed without telling you outright, like, hey, Dina's feeling a little under the weather. That's a little strange. Put a pin in that one. And we get through some gates finally. And we're heading towards Servina, which is...
Well, before we do that, we need to talk about the best scene of the open world bullshit, though.
The best scene. Oh, you're right. Yeah, I forgot to talk about the record store.
Yeah.
The one that you specifically messaged me and were like, make sure you go to the record store. Yes, that part I think is honestly my favorite part of this whole section, because it is the most like just having a moment in a place, not really like related to any massive storyline revelation or even like something really tied to sentimentality, like we're going to get to at the very end of this section, but like just a nice moment of character building between Ellie and Dina. And also like big props to Ellie, because pulling out, like, it's one thing to know how to play guitar and sing and stuff like that, but like sitting there and not just singing a little bit of a song, but like singing a good chunk of that song in front of somebody as they're just watching you, terrifying. I podcast a lot and I still get like stage fright when I do that shit, so big props to Ellie for that.
It was also like I like that the game is in different places, like finding songs to like attribute to certain people in this world, because like she starts off, the first thing that she does is she plays a little bit of Future Days, and Dina kind of like walks in like, what's that? And then she's like, nothing. Like, that's a private thing. That is something that means something very specific to Ellie, that she's maybe not even, you know, it kind of like implies that like Joel's relationship or like her relationship with Joel is kind of like something that is not necessarily more so than Dina, but just like it is very specifically like special to her in a way that's like private, and I appreciated that. But then like she kind of like basically gives Dina a song too, like something that will kind of like be a touchstone for their relationship, because like, and this isn't really a spoiler, but like if you do this scene, there is going to be a point where we're going to walk into a room and Dina is going to be humming it, and it's like really sweet. And yeah, I just like how like certain songs carry like a certain weight to certain people in this game.
Janet, what did you think of the guitar playing? Are you a guitar playing fan?
Yeah, I mean, generally, yes. I will say the first thing that struck me of this song is that, like, it's such a, you know, it's acoustic version of a song that's not traditionally a slow, like, you know, it's very, you know, Take On Me. Please listen to the original if you haven't. It's very, like, high tempo. You know, it's kind of like Mimi to me.
Yeah.
And I know that song. I listen to that song a lot because I love 80s music, because my dad is like, you know, he's in his 60s now, and the 80s were his youth. So that's like his version of like what the Arctic Monkeys are for me, right? Where it's like everything I listened to in high school and college. So it didn't hit for me as sentimentally as I think it was supposed to, because I just think it's like
There's like a jarring
it's a little goofy.
There.
Unlike with Future Days, I'll be honest, y'all, I did not even realize that was a Pearl Jam song.
No.
So I just didn't have any additional like real world association with it until like I was like, oh cool, it's whatever. And also even the real version of that song is still kind of somber to a degree versus Take On Me is very cheery. So that sort of was a little difficult to digest, but I do think the general like sentiment of it is very sweet. And what I like about this is that, again, back to like the sim elements, it's a moment to sit in. Like you can just be there and be present and like put the controller down and do that classic Sony thing that sometimes people, make fun of a little bit, where it's like, oh, playing a Sony game, like get the popcorn out, right? Lean back. It's very narrative, cinematic. Yeah. This is like, it's a really cute moment, and it kind of makes me sad that some people might not see it at all. But I guess that's what makes an enticing, open world, faux open world. Like this, if the side stuff isn't interesting, then what's the point of having it there? But then it's also like you don't want it to be so interesting that you feel like you need it. So I do think they do a good job with that overall. But it's a beautiful scene about the relationship. But I do think the song is a little upbeat 80s goofy.
Right.
It is like and maybe this is just because I'm cheesy as shit, but like I like taking those upbeat songs and turning them into little acoustic ditties. Like there are a lot of songs I think got popular because of that reason, or like the acoustic version of a song got very popular because of that. And so Ellie falling into that same thing is kind of like relatable to me as just a guitar player. I'm like, yeah, that sounds like some shit I would do. Like, I would be like, oh, I like this song, let me make it a really somber melody all of a sudden. But Ken, I did want to ask, did you mess around with the guitar afterwards?
I have
pick that guitar back up.
I have tried to like play something that like kind of sounds like shit that I know how to play in real life, and because the weird thing is like you can only really play like full chords on these things, so it's kind of like you're limited in terms.
You can like faux pick, but it doesn't ever feel accurate or correct.
Yeah. So like. So there have been a few things that I've kind of like tried to mess around and try to recreate, but it is like a very limited tool to do that with. But like we mentioned it last week that Kian like made a video, I think for VG247. I'm gonna check that I'm gonna check that in editing and make sure that that's right before I say that.
I think that's right.
I think so too.
Yeah, and just like played songs through it, and I was like, it's a cool thing. And like it is, even if like the actual sort of like playing of it is fairly limited, it is nice as a guitar player to see like, oh, they are like Ellie's got the right finger positions, and like is that they like paid attention. They paid so much attention to detail there, which is really nice to see.
And the chord wheel like makes sense for each arrangement and stuff. Like I was a little annoyed that I couldn't find one where I could get G, C, D, and E minor all on a single wheel, because like that is like a very traditional like chord structure and all that. But I did manage to get. I played Don't Fear the Reaper, which I felt was very appropriate. And then I played Kids by MGMT because they had the right chords for that on one of the wheels too. And I was very happy when I got that one working because I love that song. So.
But also in that record store, I really like the piece of dialogue where they're talking about bands and Ellie's explaining what a groupie is.
Right.
And Dina's like, oh, so that's me. And I think that's it's such a cute nod to like, their relationship dynamic, which is very, playful, flirty, obviously has like a strong root in their friendship pre-romance as well. But I think it was also kind of an interesting like little nod to the idea of a companion character and this person that's sort of the supporting actor to the hero's story. And, I think it's like, it's both a moment of acknowledging that Dina is very much side character, but also giving her that personality that is often attributed to the side character. That's like the side character of stories, like in video games at least, is often more charismatic than whoever the main person is. And I think in this case, that's true to a degree. Like Ellie is obviously very well-rounded as a character and fleshed out, but she's brooding and angsty and awkward and weird. And Dina always comes off like so much more sure of herself and stable or more well-adjusted, I guess. And even just like, bringing it back to like what y'all had mentioned with the the conversation they had at the beginning with like, oh, when's the first time you killed somebody? And for Ellie, it was when she was 14, and for Dina, it was when she was 10. And it was like, oh, like I thought I was, had some stuff, but really, like y'all, it's really puts it in context.
Right. And it does give it is an interesting comparison between the two, because like, not even just that conversation, but like throughout, Dina's role in this, she talks about like she has done some equally fucked up shit that Ellie has, and it does like kind of to have a character that has gone through this world and has come out it relatively well adjusted and like maybe not as nihilistic as a lot of other people do is like it's nice to have, and like I think it's gonna like really butt heads with some stuff later in the game, but yeah, it's just it is interesting to me like seeing the way that they are like juxtaposed against each other, and also like what it kind of says about maybe like it this world may be shitty and can do a lot of shitty things to a lot of people, but it is on the individual to kind of like find ways to cope with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we'll maybe touch on this a little bit later, so I won't mention it too much here, but I do think that this game wants you to think a little bit more about what kind of violence you're doing in it and how you feel about it. And there are several ways in which I think it does that, but I think having Dina as the counterweight to that works well here in the beginning, at least. I will also say that like having Dina around and as like the constant companion is very different from having like it be Joel and Ellie. And I dig the dynamic so far. It's like a very different dynamic from The Last of Us Part 1, but I think it just works, especially given the story that they're telling, and having that sort of counterbalance to who Ellie is, and Ellie's approach to everything is very good. It's just nice to have, like, you still have playful banter and all that. Like, Joel and Ellie always joked around, and Ellie and Dina always joke around, but the way that they joke around is a little bit different.
Right.
Just naturally. And I think it works really, really well as, like, a change of pace coming
For
right
sure.
off of Last of Us Part 1. I do...
Sorry, I know there's like so many sections of this day,
yeah.
Really quick, did y'all stop by some of the things that weren't on the map? Like, seeing the campsite, the old like army thing, like all of that.
I got the army thing, I think. I don't know if I got the campsite.
Yeah.
Is this the one where the specialty store is, or is that later?
It's like a little fire pit by a bunch of flowers.
Okay, I did not get that one.
Yeah, that one is I think it's actually near the bank, so I think if you didn't go to the bank, you might not have seen it then.
Oh yeah, probably.
Yeah, it's near the bank.
Yeah. But the implication of that campsite is that they have a moment where like Tommy must have been here, like somebody must have been here that needed shelter that did not have it readily available to them, and so yeah, like there are actually a couple points throughout, so we're gonna get like we're basically like trailing Tommy at this point that clearly has been here and might be up to shit. So
getting into some business.
You know how Tommy is.
Yeah, you know how it is.
Yeah. But was this area, or like the next open area, the part where you can find the specialty store that has Halloween stuff in it?
I think that's the next one.
The next one? Okay.
Because that was where more like shops were.
Okay, we'll put a pin in that then, because I do want to mention that specifically. It was an interesting little thing. So first open world bullshit section done. We move through the fuck Fedra gate, and we keep heading towards Cervina, which is labeled as Cervina base by a bunch of wolf letters that we find. But basically, we begin to learn that it is the Cervina Hotel. Makes a lot of sense that they would hole up in a hotel. It's pretty well equipped for that. We do find that infected have kind of hopped the gate there, so we have our easy way in, and we take out some infected. I also want to say, like, the beginning of this game was making me feel really gung-ho about, like, oh yeah, I'm super awesome, I'm stealthing all these segments, I'm so good at this video game. By the end of this section, I was like fleeing for my life in every combat. So I think it does a good job of like luring you into a false sense of security at the beginning of this section and making you think that you've totally got this managed, and I think that fits well tonally with the game. But we find Nick, one of the folks who was in the group that came to find and kill Joel, tied up to a chair, dead. And Ellie pretty quickly figures out what has been going on, and that Tommy did this because they find a second dude in a chair tipped over behind the bed who had written something in blood. And Ellie explains that this is a tactic that Joel had taught her, which is if you want to get information out of some guys, you have them each write something down. And if they write the same thing, you know they're telling the truth. And if they write something different, then you get to working on them until they start telling the truth. And I think this is definitely a moment where Dina's like, holy shit.
Right.
Like, not only just the fact that like Joel knew how to do this and taught Ellie to do this, but that Tommy also like was able to do this as well. And Dina has a line later where she's like, I knew Tommy, you said Tommy had a dark past, but I never figured it was like this. But I think the unspoken thing there is also being like, hey, so this is also something that you mentioned, like totally being like understanding what was going on and all that. And it clearly rattles Dina in a way that it does not for Ellie. Ellie's just like, oh yeah, hey, look, they did the chair trick. Like that's
Yeah.
the good old write it down trick.
Classic
Which
Tommy.
is yeah, classic Tommy. Yeah. But then Dina also like turns around and is like, you know, if my sister's killers were tied to chairs, she'd probably do the same thing. Which, hey, there you go. Running theme we're going to run.
Well,
into.
it's that classic, like, you know, trying to comfort someone even if maybe you don't necessarily totally agree. And it kind of reminds me actually of, you know, what y'all mentioned last episode with Joel confessing what he did to Tommy and Tommy being like, oh yeah, like totally understandable. And it's like, was it though? Was it? And I feel like that's kind of the same thing happening here. Like, I don't necessarily think Dina's lying, but I don't think she would necessarily tell the truth either in that case. So it could kind of go either way for me.
Yeah, I think there's a difference between like really being like I empathize with what you're doing, and more just like I am following why somebody would do that, and I know like what would bring somebody to that point.
Yeah. We head through the gate. You know, we punch in the numbers one more time. And then we fall for the oldest trick in The Last of Us Part 2, or The Last of Us any part book, which is jumping a horse over an obstacle and landing on a landmine. It's the second time in 2 video games this has happened, and I'm starting to think that everyone in the U.S. just knows that the Jackson folks fall for it every single time. Dina rolls away off the road as wolves come down upon us and knock us, Ellie, out. And we wake up face to face with Jordan, the dude whose face we messed up in Jackson. And he's clearly unhappy, but he wants to interrogate us, which is interesting. You know, he's trying to get info out of us, and another dude walks in, and he's like, no, we're supposed to just shoot trespassers on sight. And Jordan is arguing, no, come on, we can get info. There could be a larger group. We don't know what's going on here. And they start to fight with each other. You can kind of be struggling as Ellie throughout this whole section, trying to get the ropes undone. And then Dina heroically shows up and shoots one of the dudes, but then she gets the glass shot out from under her, falls down and starts struggling with Jordan. Meanwhile, we're just struggling to get glass and uncut our own rope and all that. And it's a very, very, very tense situation. I was actually like, these segments are so weird to me because I know that they're like scripted and stuff like that, and it's basically like just get it done within a certain time frame and you're good. But especially once like Dina was in danger, and this was the moment where I was like, oh, they did a good job of like reflecting some of that relationship onto me. I still felt like a sense of urgency to get it done. I wasn't just like, oh, gameplay moment, QTE, let's do this. I was actually like, gotta get this done. This is bad. I don't like this.
I think the score carried a lot of that weight. Like looking back on it, like it did that really intense like swelling. Kind of like reminded me of like how Hans Zimmer's tracks often are. That like intense like boom in the air, and I think that's what adds to like. I also felt that way, even though I'm like, this is all fake. Though you know what, all of it's fake. It's a video game, so you know the disbelief is already suspended. But yeah, it was a very stressful moment.
Yeah, for sure.
So we grab the switchblade and murder the bejesus out of Jordan. I mean, he dies. I've noticed that, especially when you kill people in this game, there seems to be just a little extra to them dying than there was in Last of Us Part 1. Like, whenever I do a stealth kill on a dude, it's not just like, oh, they're dead. They're like, they die and they have like this Mortal Kombat spray of blood come out of their neck and all that kind of stuff. And I'm like, oh, man, they
Yeah,
kind
there's
of feeling for the animators in this game.
yeah, for sure. Like there does seem to, because I mean, part one still had like this kind of moments too, but like part two is like does have that like extra step a little bit further. Like I really noticed it in the Jackson section when we were playing as Abby and doing a stealth kill. Like they go out of their way to like make the animation of her snapping the neck and also make the sound, which is not something they did in part one because like Joel just kind of strangled people in that game and like there wasn't a lot of sound to that other than people like grunting. But yeah, with Ellie, it's she's got her switchblade, so like her stealth kills are they're different from Abby's, but also I feel like they always, and this will be a recurring thing, when it comes to killing of the 8 people that came to get Joel, I don't think they ever really go like a sort of like God of War, Mortal Kombat sort of style of like really like getting into it and like making it like gratuitous. I do think by and large the Last of Us violence is kind of just very matter of fact more than it is anything that's necessarily played up, but it does feel like they do go out of their way to kind of like make those kills in particular feel significant in some way. And so this we get like, Ellie just stabs him in the neck and then like, but it goes like into his face when it's happening and it's, it like again, like
I mean,
they
hear it too. You
right.
like hear him choking on his blood and stuff. And it's
Yeah.
like, should probably say content warning at this point.
Yeah, I mean we're like how many episodes into talking about these games? People probably know.
Yeah, but also just heads up because we're also going to get to more stuff. So it's I mean, it's not Mortal Kombat and that like it's not like the Mortal Kombat 10 fatalities or anything like that. But by like you look at Mortal Kombat and that definitely does more of like so gory and ridiculous it's campy and it like spins back around, whereas this it's like it's very realistic in a way that hits a little bit. It's just a little too real. And again, we will get to more of this in like a hot second here because we're about to fight our way out of this school that we have found ourselves trapped in. And I will say I stealthed most of this. There were a few times where I got caught and I went guns blazing. And I'm going to say also that the combat in this game is absolutely phenomenal. I've like completely fallen for it. I love how it feels. Like the stealth feels great. The movement feels great. The like dodging adds so much. Going prone in different levels of grass works so much. I do kind of wish there was some sort of indicator that told you whether you're fully hidden or not. I mean, I don't feel like there's not enough context for me to be able to intuit that, but I also just, I guess that is the one place where I'm like, oh, I want the video game thing.
Right.
Show me the stealth indicator. But I did go around just like completely annihilating all these wolves that we get through like the hallways and then the courtyard and then the roof. But the one thing that did immediately stick out to me was that not only are they modeling all these characters very differently, but they're doing the thing that they touted in the marketing as well, which is like they call out each other's names and stuff like that. And it seems like there's very much an emphasis on you killing people that talk to each other, that have like goals and aspirations. There are a couple times in this section where you sneak up on some folks and they're just talking about like, oh, it's a good thing it's my last day on the watch. Tomorrow we're heading out and I'm going to finally have that nice piece of land that I've always dreamed about. And I hope I don't get stabbed in the neck today.
Oh, honey.
Yeah.
Who's going to tell him?
Yeah. And like for all the ways in which like Last of Us Part 1 did make, its human enemies, these sort of almost like cartoonish bad dudes, raiders and stuff like that you would totally expect to just be killing a ton of in the post-apocalypse, and they were all kind of the same big burly dude that was just running at you and all that. Here, having them be actual, like look more like actual people, have names and stuff like that, I'm back and forth on it because part of me is like, oh, this is a lot more believable. This is what like the people that live in the post-apocalypse would look like what their the makeup of their forces would look like. I mean, they look more like the people in Jackson. Like that makes more sense to me logically, storyline wise, but also it does feel like there's an intent for you to maybe start feeling bad about the things that you're doing, or at least start feeling conflicted about the things that you're doing. And definitely like in certain sections. So when I went up to the roof from the courtyard, and there were a bunch of wolves on the roof, and if you wait long enough, some of them will go down into the courtyard to try and figure out what happened. I let them live. Like I let them just go down to the courtyard, and I snuck by, and I felt like that was I mean, I felt like that was a moment where I was like, I've kind of killed a lot of people here today, and I think maybe if I just let a few people live, I might feel less worse about all the murder I've done. Because
Oh yeah.
like the murder is both really, really fun to do in this game, and also I feel the dial has been turned a bit to make you feel bad about it more. And did y'all feel that way about the combat in this?
I think I'm just a bad person because I didn't feel any guilt at all at this point, especially in that first playthrough. In hindsight, having seen it all through, lines like Dina saying, or it was either Dina or Ellie, or kind of both of them agreed that, oh, these people aren't like us. Like they'll shoot you on sight. You know, we're gonna like see who you are first. We're the good murderers. You know, like that definitely hits different having seen it all through. But my first time through, I was like, nah, I'm just. The gig is the gig, you know. I'm just going through it. It did feel more like intimate and personal, though. I think is an undertone of this entire game. Like, I think it's worth pointing out that the first combat that happens in this, like, I think it's called the elementary school. Eastbrook Elementary is the area. It's you're in a kindergarten classroom. Like, I think that needs to be, you know, addressed a little bit. Like, it's so like innocent, but then it's dark. It's like just like this kindergarten bloodbath. It's, you know, it's very it's just very malicious and dark, like the immediate tone. Obviously, the courtyard is like more innocuous because you're just outdoors.
Right.
This is also the first section that gave me any trouble. Like the courtyard and cafeteria took me so long to do. And in the guide, if you go to like the IGN guide for this, there are in a ridiculous amount of tips. This also had like early guide energy for me, where like I was still early enough that I'm like, I'm putting in so many details, I got time, and then, you know, eventually less. But I just struggled so hard, so I wrote like 8 million tips. So if you're bad at this area, I have a lot of tips for you. But yeah, I didn't really feel, I don't know, I never had the guilt that like people describe in this game, but maybe that's just me.
So like they do a lot in this. Like I feel like this first day that Ellie is here in Seattle is their point to do like a lot of world building in terms of like who the WLF were. Like, you know, like through various notes and stuff that we find out they were basically like a group that believed themselves to be like the quote, like the Fireflies of Seattle, and they kind of had an uprising against the military, but they also like put in their own martial law. Like you'll find banners of like basically like if you don't follow the WLF, you're shot on sight. Like so. It is like, you know, they do, I think, you know, a good job of like maybe personalizing the enemies that you're doing, but I don't feel like you're not like going into like a small community of people that you're just like going to fuck up for no fucking reason. Like you are dealing with people that are the orders to shoot you on sight, that have become part of like a nation that has essentially, you know, they took down the government, and that, you know, depending on the situation is, you know, whatever, but like they are like basically bringing people in that we're living in Seattle and like, hey, it's our way or the highway. And so like, I don't know, like there's, I do think that like what you're talking about, Eric, is like kind of like having that weight is like a more interesting way of talking about like the idea of bringing guilt upon yourself in this game than pretending that Last of Us is some kind of like metatextual gotcha moment, which I think is what a lot of the quote unquote guilt discussion around this game ends up being. But as far as like these wolves, I'm like not really feeling that, because like the game has given you plenty of reason to understand like they might just be like in the way of what your actual goal is, but they aren't fucking friendly people that have stumbled into your line of fire.
Right. Yeah, I don't think it's anything like Spec Ops: The Line, where it's like, haha, guess what, you actually committed a war crime, surprise. It's more like they're just trying to make that. I liked what Janet said, that it's like more intimate. It's more like personal. You know, you're not just kind of killing video game enemies. It seems like there's a real effort made to make these like characters that you're killing, almost like, you know, they've got a D&D role-playing sheet for each one of these characters that
Yeah.
you're murdering, and you're just tearing it up with each one. And that, you know, it's not quite the level of like, oh, you know, that I imagine we'll probably get to when we get to a later part where two certain characters clash, but it is the level of like, you're not just kind of killing an enemy in the same way that you handle like a clicker or an infected or something like that.
Yeah, I think you, Eric, bringing up like how good the combat is in this game too, like really helps support some of that, because in The Last of Us 1, especially like playing The Last of Us 1 today, which I know might not need to be the case anymore if, you know, the remake actually ends up happening of that game. It might feel different. But playing that game today, the combat is very like slapstick at times, especially if you're not like that skilled. So like for me playing that game, like I had my stealth attempts, but it was a very much like a jank stealth run for me, where I'm stealth until I just start swinging like clubs at people. And it's like, you know, it's honestly just a little bit
Started
goofy.
blasting.
Yeah, like I no, but like so much of my gameplay in Last of Us 1, it didn't feel like, oh, it's the end of the world. I'm like, look, I have a 2x4 and I'm just knocking people out. And sometimes I put the nail in the 2x4 and I'm just out here swinging for the fences, you know. And you know, Last of Us traditionally too hasn't been that difficult of a game in terms of health and the loop of dying personally. Like that's been my experience with it, where it's easy enough that I can get away with being more melee oriented, a little bit more reckless. But not only does Ellie like not really play that way because, you know, she controls very differently than Joel does and other characters, but also the AI is too smart for you to really do that very much. Like you can do it a little bit, but I'm not laughing during combat as much as I did in Last of Us 1, where sometimes I'd be in silly scenarios and I could just kind of bomb my way out of it. I can't get away with that here, and that kind of helps keep the tone.
Right.
Yeah. There's a specific moment that I think like captured a lot of this that we're going to be coming up on in a little bit, so I'll talk about then. But once we get through the school and we start working our way out, we do this like goofy jump. So this is maybe the time I need to talk about this. I want to know whoever had the idea to put platforming in The Last of Us. I just want to talk. I just want to talk. Like I do not like the jumping stuff specifically, because I think most of the other stuff in this game is at least some level of, I'm going to say tolerable, because I'm not wild about any of the rope puzzles or anything either, mostly because I think in some cases they're incredibly unclear. Like there's a specific rope that you have to use to get into the TV station that it took me way too long to find.
Even having played this game multiple times, it took me a second to try and figure out where the fuck that rope was.
And also in the same TV station, there's a part where you're supposed to like sneak along the outside of the building and get in through a window, and that also took me forever to find. So I think this is me once again saying I think there are just some general like issues with signposting where a player is supposed to go when it's not a natural sort of way that they have progressed before. But I think the rope stuff specifically just never seems interesting enough to me. Like it's just novel at best, but it's fine. Like I get that they have to have something to create some sort of interesting, you know, like puzzle or thing to do that isn't just the combat or walking around. So I'm ultimately fine with it, but it's the jumping, especially like the L1X jump, never feels good, and I feel like that's intentional. I feel like every time you do one of those big jumps, it's supposed to be that like gasp of like, you know, is Ellie going to make it? Am I going to miss the jump? Like you have one during the big gate at the beginning of this section, and you have one again here where you go from the school to the apartments, and I feel like it's intentional. That's supposed to feel like a moment where you're just in the middle of the air and you're like, did I jump far enough? Did I nail the jump or not? But I think doing it over and over again just makes me more and more like, this never feels good to do. This never feels right to do. And I also, Ellie has some goofy just like moments where you have to kind of just fall and just like kind of walk off a cliff to get down something. And I don't think the verticality and the platforming specifically is adding a lot to this game.
Yeah, it is especially interesting considering this is the same studio that makes Uncharted, that those games do have like platforming, and like that is like core to those games. Not to say that like Uncharted's platforming and climbing is like stellar or anything, but it is like more naturally integrated into a lot of things than it really reveals in part 2.
Makes a little bit more sense for that character, I think.
Yeah.
Because it's like an Indiana Jones type character.
Right.
That's like, you're supposed to be leaping across cliffs, and I think it fits Nathan Drake's journey a little bit, as like, you know, I've obviously seen some of the scenes, like, you know, climbing up the plane and all that, where it's, you know, that makes sense for who that character is. And I don't know that it fits the setting of The Last of Us necessarily, or even fits like who Ellie is, that all of a sudden you're doing these like big platforming areas. It just, in a world that does feel pretty natural, and I have really begun to appreciate like how much more natural the world feels and the combat arenas feel. It feels like the one unnatural part where I'm like, oh look, all these things have been arranged so I could probably platform between them if I wanted to. Yes, I don't know. Janet, do you like platforming?
In life, like in general, in games, yes. And in this one, it doesn't stick with me as heavily, but I do get what you're saying. I think part of it is just how the degree to which Ellie swings her arms around. Like, she kind of has the physical reaction of if you ever lightly move your cat. Like if you have a cat and just kind of toss them, you know, from like the sofa to the floor. The sort of kind of disarray yet nimbleness, I think, is how I'd sort of describe her motion there. So I can see how that sticks out, and it definitely isn't like my favorite, you know, aspect. I will say, like, you know, earlier in this what is a chapter? I guess it technically is. It's a really long chapter. Like when I was in the synagogue, I was doing like the rope swing thing, and I fell from the rope because I just miscalculated, and it took me a long time to like re-grab the rope and like little stuff like that. It's like, oh, maybe this doesn't need to be here.
Right.
Yeah. I know there's going to be more, because when I was telling this to a friend of the show, Jesse Vitelli, he told me that there's more rope puzzles and swinging and platforming to come. So not looking forward to that. But we get into the apartment complex and start moving our way through it. Taking stock of kind of where we are and where we need to go. On the body of Jordan, we had found some information, basically a letter and a picture of someone named Leah, who was one of the 8 that was in Jackson. She sent whatever the post-apocalyptic, you know, version of sliding into someone's DMs to Jordan, a provocative picture and a letter about her being stationed up at the TV station. So we've got to make our way there because maybe she's got some info if she's connected in some way. And we get into kind of, I'd say, what is the second open world section of the game, though it's a little bit more straightforward. There are like some patrols, and I took out some patrols here. And there are a few places that I think are probably more easily missable. I think a big one to shout out is and Ken, I'll let you take the wheel for this one, but the queer bookstore that we run into.
Yeah, so I will admit that I had to put this part of my notes after I played, because I realized when I got to the end of this, I was like, oh, I fucking forgot to stop by there. And I think something that is interesting, I guess, about these this more open space is that, like, if you're in what the game perceives as like in combat mode, like Dina and Ellie won't have conversations that they might have in that same setting. So you have to like take out enemies and then come back. And there is like a patrol that's kind of around here. So like I have in my other playthroughs, I've had to walk through and not have the conversation because I was trying to stealth my way like past them. But in the event that you have killed all the enemies around, like they sit in this queer bookstore for a second, and there's like a moment where, and like we talked about this in the Left Behind episode, but I think this is like where it actually like shows its face more, is that like these two queer women have like grown up in a world where like what we know as queer culture doesn't really exist, because like they don't know what the pride flags are, because like they don't really understand like why are all the books here like about like queer pairings. Like it's like something like sorority secrets or something, and it's like the characters on the cover like look kind of like Dina and Ellie, and so like Dina's like, hey, it's us, and you know they have the one where they still don't really understand like what they're standing in, and it kind of like it's not something that the game ever like goes out of its way to be like, hello, this is like an example of like how culture does not survive the apocalypse sometimes, and it just kind of like made my stomach drop because like it is kind of like why like, and we'll get into it later, like in one of the flashback scenes, like you can read Ellie's journal, like what she's doing in that particular point in time, and she's still like trying to figure herself out, even though like she had like her exchange with Riley and like that relationship, and it seems to have like a sense of who she is, but like she is still struggling with the fact that like she is still othered in a way because like she's not seeing a lot of like queer people to look up to in Jackson, so like she still feels like something's off about me or something's different, and yeah, it's like we were talking about it last week when Allie was on, that we're talking about like it feels like Jackson kind of like falls into like the lowest common denominator of like what quote unquote culture is in that space, and that's why it does feel like very much like an American small town and has like certain prejudices that still like survive through that, but like these characters don't like again, they don't know what Pride Flag is, they don't know why there would be a store dedicated specifically to like queer literature and like queer history, and it's just like it's a really sad moment for me because like it shows that like culture is a casualty of the apocalypse just as much as people are, and it's you know, again and again, like I've even said, like I think in the Left Behind episode, like I was like I understand like if that does not sit right with you, and I know that because I think that is like a very tragic, harmful, hurtful thing to see, but like again, as a person that has lived in like a small town his entire life and has seen that like those touchstones don't exist where I live, and knows that like people can be very distant from that kind of stuff for like their whole life to the point where like they don't really understand what it is they're looking at, and yeah, it's a really fucking sad thing, and I don't think the game even outwardly says that it is sad. I think it's just something that that is like specifically for the player to understand why that is sad. And while the two of them kind of like don't really know where they are, what they're like, what the cultural touchstone of being here meant to some people before the apocalypse.
I felt like it was a double whammy because this is around the same part where you can find a specialty store which has a bunch of Halloween stuff in it, and the one comment that I had when I was going through it was Dina was like, "Oh, look at this! It's all like, you know, all this spooky monsters and stuff like that." And Ellie's just kind of like, "Yeah, it's Halloween stuff. It's a Halloween store." And Dina's like, "What? Do you not like any of this?" And she's like, "Not really." And it's just like ends it right there. And I was like, "Oh, that hits a little different."
Right.
On thanks to Left Behind, it's like, oh, that's still a especially if you go from the bookstore and reading the back of that Sorority Secrets book and all that, and then going right into the specialty store, like it's a 1-2 punch.
Yeah.
A reminder of kind of the emotional toll that Ellie has gone through. I do also want to shout out in this bookstore is a training combat manual, whatever you want to call it, a manual, and we haven't really talked about the way that they're doing upgrades in this game, but basically it feels like you get a lot more of the pills overall, and you kind of have different branches that you go down, and I think this was the one where you get the stealth one, because it specifically unlocks the ability to make makeshift silencers for your pistol, which are just goofy as hell. But it's basically a Coke bottle. Yeah, which like does work. I think I watched a video recently. GameSpot's been doing a bunch of videos where they talk to a firearms expert in London about, you know, different video game guns and stuff like that and how realistic the representation is and all that. And they did one about The Last of Us where he called out that like, yeah, this, if you wanted to get one silenced shot, this would effectively work. You know, like the end of the Coke bottle might affect the trajectory of the bullet in a way that wouldn't be great. And obviously, like, the weirder thing is that you get 3 uses out of the base one and 5 out of the upgraded one, but it would realistically only work once, right? Because after you've shot once, you've kind of blown up your Coke bottle. But just as like a gameplay tool and mechanic, this is a game changer right here. I mean, I was the wolves that I met after this had 0 chance. There is and in the same area too, like near the bookstore, there is a patrol, and you can actually, there's some infected, I think, inside the bookstore that you can like alert to the presence of the patrol and kind of sick them on each other like Left Behind. And as we get further into the section, we will run into even more situations like that. But just some cool carry forward of ideas and evolutions of the combat here. But I think this was actually the part of Last of Us Part 2 where I was really like the open world bullshit at the beginning. I was not really feeling it. I was like, this is interesting. This is novel, but it did feel kind of not like The Last of Us. Whereas once we got to this part, like leading up into the TV station, I was like, okay, this is way more like what I was expecting and also like what I was hoping for from this game. So both in terms of writing and in terms of game playing. We keep on moving towards the TV station and we get to a whole area rigged up with tripwires. They brought back the good old tripwires. Actually, I should mention before we get there, we do find Tommy's horse dead, eaten by the infected, and Dina throws up from the smell. Curious when that didn't happen with the moose earlier in this game, but it does happen here. Put another pin in that.
It's best not to read into these things.
Yeah. I appreciate some good foreshadowing in my writing. I understand it's a tool. It's supposed to like ramp it up. But even by this point, I was like, I know what you're going to do now. I know what this is going to be. Like you're not hiding it, Naughty Dog.
I totally didn't I didn't notice at all. I'm not gonna lie. I had no indicate. Like I just didn't think about that as a possibility for some reason.
Yeah, I was the same way. It was one of the things where like, oh, that's what that meant, but like it was, my mind did not immediately go there as soon as she started puking.
See, now I feel weird for thinking for reading this one coming.
I think I wasn't personally sure like how much time has passed with like her and Jesse and things like that, and like where her like life was, and also I don't know, it's an apocalypse. Like I just didn't like think of that. I think all the normal stuff tends to sort of fall away in some ways, and I think like where they take things is like a weird blending of bringing back normalcy and like normal problems. Like this game delves into a lot of like very mundane issues while also dealing with like the worst things that can happen in the universe. Also, really quick before we get to the TV station, I just want to shout out all of the lovely small businesses and chains and things in this area. Like I love that stuff so much. And again, it's always rewarded with like manuals or a story or whatever. And I just like get such a kick out of it. I actually own and am currently drinking out of my Rustin coffee mug from the like fake in-universe coffee place, because they sell it on the PlayStation Store, which is awesome because I love game stuff that you don't, even though unfortunately on the back of the mug it just say Last of Us Part 2 because branding. Yeah. But if it wasn't for that, you would have no way of knowing what it was. Like I got such a kick out of that, like staring at the the orange juice shop and looking through the grocery store and like all of that stuff. I just love it.
Makes it feel more like you can really see that it was a place that humanity used to live in, and seeing the contrast between what you would imagine this bookstore, this coffee shop looked like. It could be one that's down the street from you, but now it's in this state of disrepair. It's filled with clickers. It's seeing that contrast again. It is highlighting that difference between the reality of The Last of Us and the sort of normalcy of everyday human life. We will talk a little bit about Dina's predicament later when it does actually get revealed, because I have some questions. But we'll put a pin in that for now, because we gotta get through some trip mines, which are once again just all kinds of goofy, but they do some fun stuff with it. There's one where you round a corner and Dina is just like stop, and like there's a wire right there, and I was like walking straight into it without even noticing it. And it's such a good little moment. I don't know if that's like a natural thing or if that only happens if you get near one intentionally or not, but it was a cool little thing to just kind of shout out and be like, hey, also you don't have the bow and arrow here, so you're having to use like bricks and bottles to break these wires, and there's a whole lot of them too. So they do some fun stuff in terms of having to like get different angles on things, like on the stairwell, and which is generally like a really interesting area. Cool way to bring that idea back.
Yeah.
We get into the TV station. We climb up through some like, modern architecture and a silly rope that took me way too long to find. But we get into the lobby, and there's some soldiers that are like strung up from the rafters, essentially. They're all kinds of. I mean, we find some people that are obviously dead from something, and we've been finding soldiers that have obviously been shot. That appears very much like Tommy's MO, and obviously we found Tommy's horse. But the stuff that we find in the TV station is a little bit different, a little bit more aggressive, and also it like leaves a message, which is not necessarily what Tommy would be wanting to do. So we have an idea here that something's a little off, something's a little wrong, and we up to this point we've been hearing the name Scars and all that as like a faction, like a group of people. This is where I think they start to speculate that maybe the Scars are the ones who are doing this and not necessarily Tommy. But we eventually find Leah here, dead in the radio room with a bunch of arrows sticking out of her body. Also very interesting. Mostly because somebody has a bow and I don't, and I take offense to that. We find a bunch of Polaroids of their group. Some of them make Ellie pretty mad, obviously, because they're taken like right outside Jackson. It's all them like smiling and taking selfies and stuff like that, like hashtag friend vacay and all that right outside Jackson. And then we find Abby and Ellie's like, that's her. That's who we're looking for. And Dina like kind of brings her back in. It's like, hey, come on. 3 down, right? Like we're making progress here. Right. And then the radio picks up and we hear the patrol is coming in, and we get through another stealth combat section. We fight a bunch of dudes. A lot of people come in, and eventually like it gets to the point where we're moving through this area. There's so many that we have to just kind of book it and take off running. And that's another weird thing about The Last of Us Part 2, I guess, is that it seems like this is going to be a running theme of literally running, like just going through these set pieces where we are being chased by whatever forces, and we're having to just book it through stuff. And I remember that was a thing in The Last of Us Part 1 as well. Like there's one very specific moment in Boston, I think it was, where we did that. But here, like we've already done it twice in the first 2 sections of the game. So it's weird. I don't know.
They seem to use it as a way to like guide you from one like section of the game to the next, because that generally like, because one point they did it, the point they did it last time was when Abby was running from like a horde and then ended up with Joel and Tommy. So like I feel like when it's basically like a quick way for them to transfer you from one section to another. It's like, because we're going from the TV station to the subway station here, and they've kind of got to use enemies to kind of like guide you towards that path.
Makeshift fast travel.
It does feel kind of like a flex too, because it's Naughty Dog being like, we've made all these elaborate, intricate environments, and now you're going to run through them at like breakneck speed and just like sprint through all of them, and they all look really nice. They all look really, really good. But as I was running through them, I was just thinking in my head, like, this is so much game world we're running through. There's so much stuff happening here, and like, video games are all to some extent like a magic trick, like the way that they force perspective in ways, and the ways that they make do with what they can to give you like the most feeling of being in a place, even if you obviously every time you go to the Citadel in Mass Effect, they're not rendering the entire Citadel. And here I was just kind of constantly amazed by the tricks they were pulling off to make these worlds feel so big and these set pieces feel so interesting, even as you're like, they exist to be sprinted through, but they're still like very detailed and very interesting. And it takes us into what I would say is like visually one of the most interesting parts of the game we've seen thus far, which is the subway station. There are spores, so clearly we have to put our masks on because masks are what we need against spores, right? Right, Ellie? So,
Sure. It's like she's pretending she doesn't have the vaccine yet.
oh God. She's already gotten 2 shots, and Dina's like, "Hey, let's go get the Johnson and Johnson," and Ellie's like, "Yeah, sure, let's go do that." Um, so we crawl our way through this area. A lot of good like squeezing through tiny spots that definitely made my skin crawl in many different ways because I'm like, no, I think I'll just let the zombies get me. I'm good. I don't want to go in there. We do find various notes and such. One of my favorite parts here is we get to this area that is visually the thing I love about this area is that it's very dark. You can use your flashlight in some areas, though you do want to like turn it off in others just so you're not giving your position away and all that. But they have these red flares that are lighting up the tunnels. And oh my God, just the visual is so good.
It's so beautiful. It's like probably my favorite section. Like one of my favorite sections in the whole game. It's so aesthetic, and then it's like it's got all the combat trappings that are just so enjoyable to do of like messing with turning enemies on each other, and like it's just made for like if you didn't stop and take a bunch of photos here, like did you even go through the tunnels? Like it's just so it's just so cinematic and pretty looking, but also really gross.
Right.
And it's chaotic too. Like the part that you get to where it's this open area where there's a squad moving in, but there's also clickers in the area, and you can actually watch as these NPC characters are doing like what you would do, which is they move around and they try to like dodge the clickers without making sound and stuff like that. And so you can pick up these bottles and chuck them to like create sound where they are and move the clickers to different areas. And I was getting into all kinds of situations where I was in a firefight while also trying to dodge clickers or like trick some clickers into running into a guy I was having a firefight with. And it was just, I mean, I know you could probably play it and be super stealthy and precise and safe and all that, but it felt so good as just a mosh pit of chaos. And, even when the part that I got to eventually where you open the door and move on past the combat arena, like it felt realistic that they were still being chased by a clicker, because I was absolutely still being chased by a clicker when I ran to that, because I hit a point where I was like, this is just getting overwhelmed. I need to get to the next area. I don't know if I can hold out here forever. And so I just took off sprinting, and I could hear clickers running behind me. And I was like, oh God, move. Just a spectacular set piece. Like this is so good. I loved all of this. We find even more stuff about WLF defectors as well. We find a corpse that has been somewhat burned in a way, possibly by acid, something that we have not seen before. I do want to shout out that we found a thing way at the beginning of the section that like listed out the 4 stages of infected, and the idea of like, okay, here's what we know as the runners, and then the phantom stalkers, something like that. And then obviously the clickers and the bloaters, which they call stage 1, 2, 3, and 4. But soon we are going to deal with shamblers, which are a new type that explodes? Question mark.
Real video game shit.
I don't know if I like the I'm gonna be real. I don't like shamblers.
I think they are, in terms of like what the encounter entails, the least interesting of all of like the sort of variations of the infected. And I also like, and maybe this comes up later and we'll be able to talk about it then, but like I feel like they don't do a great job of like explaining the stage, or like how an infected becomes that, and like how we've never encountered it before, because like there's going to be something that happens later in this game where like we're going to kind of meet a new type of infected, and there's going to be like an in-universe context for why that thing exists. And I just don't feel like they ever got that with Shamblers, and I'm not sure if we ever do get it, but like right now I was just like it also is like huge fucking video game shit. Like the thing is going to self-destruct, and like you can't stealth it like a clicker, so it kind of like exists in that like a bloater does, where like your tactics have to change in like a way that like the sort of like quiet ways you normally take things out are not an option here. So it's just like I don't know that like it really, at least here specifically, like we might get into something later. I just don't feel like it added much in any facet, really, in terms of my understanding of the infected and how to fight them, and other than just like don't be near it when it dies, I guess is the only thing that you really gotta keep track of, and I guess different than a bloater.
Yeah, I think that's
Janet,
fair.
Yeah, how did you feel about these, Janet?
Yeah, they weren't like as big of a deal as I think it was sort of implied they would be either. So it feels a little bit underdeveloped, and I think like as y'all kind of already hinted at, like the shock of the bloaters like originally was like, oh, it's such a big deal, and this is like, oh, it's the remix. Basically, is the only real difference. I mean, I do like the design generally. You know, it's disgusting.
Right.
It kind of has like the little like pus balls sort of remind me of eyeballs, so it's a little Resident Evil. Like I can appreciate that element of it, but I wasn't blown away by these. Not nearly as much as how like the you know, this isn't new, like the stalkers, but like the way they kind of were further introduced like later on in this game, like that more stood out to me than like the introduction of Shamblers. I already almost forgot the name.
Right.